The current phase of the war between Ukraine and Russia is often compared to the trench battles of the First World War. Both sides have dug hundreds of miles of trenches and almost stopped their advance. In many parts of the front, if there are changes, they're just hundreds and sometimes even only tens of meters. Today, we'll talk about the latest changes on the front line and try to analyze whether Ukraine will be able to make the breakthrough that everyone expects, or if it already failed as Russian propaganda claims. This is a conflict report. The Ukrainian offensive, which began on June 4th, has finally reached its first culmination 2 months later. Apparently, it was not conceived as a single operation, but as a series of strikes, spaced out in time and space. First of all, the attacking troops had to overcome 7 to 10 kilometers separating their positions from the fortified line of defense of the Russian army. Now, this task can be considered accomplished. Probably, according to the plan of the Ukrainian command, this should have happened much earlier. But the advancing forces suffered heavy losses in minefields from Russian artillery, anti-tank missile systems, and helicopter gunships. Finally, in the last days of July, the Ukrainian army began to storm several villages and towns that could be considered part of the main defense line of the Russian armed forces. Thus, new military units that had been trained abroad specifically for the counteroffensive were first spotted in the Orikhiv direction. Here, back in June, these units failed in their attempt to break through by the shortest route from Orikhiv to Tokmak, an important logistics center in the rear of the Russian defense in Zaporizhzhia region. However, the 7-kilometer journey through no man's land to the nearest Russian-held village of Rabotny took almost 2 months. Finally, by the 20th of July, the Ukrainian armed forces managed to bypass Rabotny from the east and advanced toward it from the north. To do this, the Ukrainian command had to use large reserves. At present, Ukrainian troops on this part of the front are stuck in the first line of defense, and their advance has slowed down in recent days. The front near Bakhmut is also active, due to the fact that the Russian army captured it only at the end of last winter. It did not have time to build a reliable line of defense or mine the surrounding fields enough. After many weeks of fighting in the south of this section of the front, Ukraine managed to push the Russian armed forces, which had replaced Wagner's PMC, away from the Seversky-Donets-Donbas Canal and the Bakhmut-Konstantinivka Highway. During July, Ukrainian troops, despite the deployment of Russian reserves to the area, managed to capture a stronghold on the hills west of the villages of Klishchivka and Andriivka. At the end of July, Ukrainian troops began to storm these villages. Currently, the Ukrainian military controls part of Klishchivka, while Russia, under the cover of artillery, is trying to pull its troops further east and take up a new line of defense. If Ukrainian troops succeed in liberating Klishchivka and Andriivka, they will be able to approach the southern outskirts of Bakhmut, as Wagner's mercenaries did when they seized these villages in midwinter. However, they should not bring down the Russian defense, although it will complicate it. The main supply lines of the Russian group, Bakhmut-Popasna and Bakhmut-Solidar roads, are located to the northeast and are still somewhat reliable. In an effort to slow down Ukraine's offensive and draw back its reserves, Russia has been conducting its own offensive on the northern part of the front for more than a month. A major offensive by Russian forces on the border of Luhansk, Donetsk, and Kharkiv regions led to a major initial success. Russian troops forced their way across the Zherebets River, established a foothold on the western bank, and captured several small villages. In some parts of the front, the depth of the breakthrough was up to 4 miles. This still forced the Ukrainian command to send additional units to help. So far, the newly arrived troops have stabilized the situation and pushed the Russian army back a bit, although Russia still has a bridgehead on the western bank 3 miles wide. Due to the minimal territorial changes in recent weeks, Many have begun to compare the current phase of the war to the trench warfare of the First World War. However, much more accurate would be to draw an analogy to the American offensive in France during the Second World War. In the summer of 1944, after landing in Normandy, the Allied forces were forced to slowly bite through the Nazi defense for 6 weeks, having marched only 19 miles to the French city of Saint-Lô. Only then did a real breakthrough occur and the active phase of the liberation of France began. Similar events took place during the liberation of the Kherson region. At first, Ukrainian troops systematically exhausted the Russian garrison on the western bank of the Dnipro River. After that, in November, Russia was forced to retreat, and in a month, Ukraine liberated an area larger than the state of Rhode Island. For now, the West and Ukraine hope to repeat last year's success. However, this time Russia is much more prepared, and whether Ukrainian counteroffensive will succeed or not, we will know in the future. That's all for today. Please like and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with the latest news from the front line.